Hey guys, welcome to Missing Chronicle. I'm glad you're here tonight. Tonight, we're carefully descending a narrow stone staircase. Your hand touches the wall, which feels colder than the night air itself. The torchlight behind you dims, and with each step, the warmth of the outer world quietly slips away. You probably won't survive this. At best, it's uncomfortable. Before we begin, like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and imagine the door closing behind you with a dull, final sound. The echo lingers longer than you'd expect. In the silence that follows, you begin to feel the stone. Not just see it, but feel it. Stone beneath your feet, stone at your back, stone above your head. In the medieval world, stone symbolized safety, authority, and power, but for those locked within these walls, it meant cold, isolation, and endless nights. Tonight, we'll talk about how medieval prisoners tried to sleep, how they survived in freezing chambers, and what it was like to rest on bare stone. Introduction: The Architecture of Despair. The year is 1347, somewhere beneath a fortress in northern France. The sound of iron scraping against iron echoes through corridors that haven't seen sunlight since the day they were carved from bedrock. These are not basements or storage cellars repurposed for confinement. These are purpose-built prisons, designed with the specific intention of holding human beings in conditions that break both body and spirit. Medieval prison architecture followed a brutal logic. The deeper beneath ground level, the more secure the confinement. The colder the stone, the less likely a prisoner would have the strength to attempt escape. The absence of light meant disorientation, the loss of time's passage, the erosion of hope itself. These were not accidents of construction, but deliberate features. The stone used in medieval prison construction was typically limestone or granite, materials chosen not just for structural strength, but for their thermal properties. Stone absorbs cold and holds it, creating an environment where winter temperatures could drop below freezing and remain there for months. In summer, the same stone that preserved winter's cold would trap heat, turning cells into suffocating chambers where the air itself seemed to press down on prisoners like a physical weight. But why were these prisons built at all? The answer reveals much about medieval society's understanding of justice, punishment, and human worth. Prisons in the medieval period served multiple functions, and those functions determined who ended up sleeping on stone and under what conditions. First, there were political prisoners, nobles who had fallen from favor, clergy who had challenged authority, merchants who had become too powerful or too vocal. These prisoners were valuable, either as hostages for ransom or as examples to others who might consider rebellion. They were kept alive but confined, their continued existence serving the purposes of those who imprisoned them. Their cells were still stone, still cold, still dark, but they might receive better food, the occasional visit, perhaps even writing materials. Second, there were common criminals, thieves, debtors, those accused of assault or murder. For these prisoners, confinement was both punishment and practical containment while they awaited trial, execution, or, in rare cases, release. The conditions of their imprisonment reflected society's judgment of their worth, which is to say, very little. They slept on bare stone not because no alternative existed, but because the alternative, straw, blankets, even wooden platforms, cost money, and society saw no reason to spend money on the comfort of criminals. Third, there were religious prisoners, heretics, accused witches, monks, or nuns who had violated their vows. These prisoners occupied a strange category. They were often educated, articulate, capable of reading and writing. Their imprisonment was meant to encourage recantation, to break their will, and bring them back into conformity with church doctrine. The stone cells were part of a spiritual warfare, designed to make the prisoner long for the light of salvation, to make submission seem like freedom. The social structure of imprisonment created hierarchies even within the depths of these prisons. A nobleman imprisoned for treason might occupy a cell with a window, small, barred, but admitting light and air. A peasant imprisoned for poaching might be thrown into an oubliette with no light source whatsoever. A wealthy merchant might bribe his way into receiving a blanket or an extra ration of food. A pauper would receive only what kept him barely alive. This brings us to the central question, the mystery that haunted every new prisoner on their first night in a medieval dungeon. How do you sleep on stone? The human body is not designed for contact with cold, hard surfaces over extended periods. Our ancestors slept on earth, on grass, on animal skins, on straw. Even the poorest peasant in medieval Europe would have had some form of bedding, a sack stuffed with dried leaves, a pile of hay in the corner of a one-room cottage, something to cushion the body from the ground. To suddenly find yourself on bare stone, with no cushioning, no warmth, no softness whatsoever, was a shock that the body struggled to process. The first night was universally described by those who survived imprisonment as the worst. Not because the conditions were worse on that first night. They would remain consistently terrible, but because the body and mind had not yet adapted. The shock of stone against hip bone, the immediate leaching of body heat into the floor, the realization that this was not temporary but the new reality. These combined to make sleep nearly impossible. But human beings are extraordinarily adaptable. We are survivors by nature, capable of adjusting to circumstances that initially seem unendurable. Over days and weeks, prisoners would develop techniques, strategies, and mental frameworks that made sleep on stone possible. Not comfortable, not restorative in the way we understand healthy sleep, but possible. Part 1. The Daily Rhythm of Stone. Guillaume had been counting stones in the wall of his cell for 3 months before he realized he was doing it. Not counting to any particular number, not trying to catalog every stone in the wall, but simply running his fingers along the mortar lines, feeling the edges where one stone ended and another began. It was something to do with his hands during the long hours between the morning meal. If you could call a bowl of thin gruel a meal, and the evening darkness when the guard would make his final rounds. The cell Guillaume shared with 3 other men measured 12 feet by 8 feet, dimensions he had calculated by lying full length on the floor and using his body as a measuring stick. The ceiling was perhaps 7 feet high, low enough that a tall man had to stoop slightly. There was no window. Light entered only when the guard opened the small hatch in the iron door to pass through food bowls or to check that all prisoners were still alive. The daily rhythm of prison life was dictated not by the sun, which Guillaume never saw, but by the sounds that filtered down from the levels above. The morning began with the distant clanging of a bell, probably from the fortress chapel, followed perhaps an hour later by the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the scraping of the food hatch opening. Each cell would receive a single wooden bowl containing gruel, watered wine, and, if fortune favored them, a heel of bread so hard it had to be soaked in liquid before eating. The 4 men in Guillaume's cell had developed a system. They took turns being responsible for the food bowl, collecting it from the hatch, dividing the contents as equally as possible, ensuring that each man received his share. This rotation served multiple purposes. It prevented accusations of favoritism or theft. It gave each man a small measure of responsibility and purpose, and it established a daily marker that helped track the passage of time. After the morning meal came what Guillaume thought of as the active hours. This was when prisoners who still had strength would move, would pace the limited space of the cell, would exercise in whatever ways the confined space allowed. Guillaume had been a soldier before his imprisonment on charges of deserting his post, charges he still insisted were false, though no one cared about his insistence. He maintained a military discipline, performing push-ups against the wall, squats, stretches. His cellmates watched at first with curiosity, then with something approaching respect, and eventually 2 of them began joining him in these exercises. The physical activity served multiple purposes. It generated body heat, critical in the unheated cell where breath turned to mist even in spring. It maintained muscle mass and strength, which otherwise would waste away on the inadequate diet. It occupied the mind, preventing the spiral into despair that came with too much idle time. And it exhausted the body, making sleep slightly more likely when night came. But the most important function of these morning exercises was that they established routine and routine was essential for maintaining sanity. In a place where days blended into weeks and weeks into months with no visible markers of time's passage, the self-imposed structure of morning exercises became a kind of anchor. It said, "We are still human, we still have will, we still exert some control over our existence." After the active hours came what Guillaume called the quiet time. This was when the exhaustion from exercise combined with the hunger that was never fully satisfied would force the prisoners into a state of rest. Not sleep. It was too early for sleep, and sleeping during the day would make the nights even more unbearable. But a kind of wakeful rest, where men would lean against walls or sit with their backs braced, eyes half closed, minds drifting. This was when stories would be told. Jean, the oldest of the four cellmates, had been imprisoned for debt. He had been a merchant, had traveled throughout France and into the Germanic lands, had seen things and heard tales. In the quiet hours, he would tell these stories. Not in a formal way, not sitting up as a performer might, but in a low, conversational tone, as if he were simply remembering aloud. He told of a village where every house was painted blue because of a local superstition that blue kept away evil spirits. He described the great cathedral at Reims, with its stone carved so delicately it looked like lace, with windows of colored glass that turned sunlight into pools of red and blue and gold on the floor. He recalled the taste of wine from the Loire Valley, the smell of bread baking in a German tavern, the sound of a market day in Lyon with vendors calling out their wares and customers haggling over prices. These stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They reminded the prisoners that a world existed beyond stone walls, that they had once been part of that world, that they might, perhaps, be part of it again someday. The stories were a form of hope, but also a form of torture, because they highlighted the contrast between past freedom and present confinement. The afternoon would drag on with the same activities repeated, a bit more exercise, more stories, sometimes arguments that would flare up over nothing and then die away just as quickly. The men learned to read each other's moods, to know when someone needed space and when they needed company. In the confined space of the cell, emotional intelligence became a survival skill as important as physical endurance. As the light from the corridor dimmed, the guards would extinguish most torches to save fuel. The prisoners would know that evening was approaching. There would be one more food delivery, even smaller than the morning one, usually just bread and water. And then the long night would begin. This was the time they all dreaded. The time when sleep had to be attempted despite the cold, despite the hardness of the stone, despite the fear and the hunger and the pain. This was when the question that haunted every prisoner became unavoidable. How will I sleep tonight? The preparation for sleep was a ritual that varied by individual but followed certain common patterns. First, there was the claiming of space. Although the four men had established regular sleeping positions through unspoken agreement, there was still a nightly process of settling, of each man moving to his designated area and arranging himself. Guillaume's position was against the eastern wall. Not that he could see east or west in the perpetual darkness, but the walls had been assigned cardinal directions in the prisoners' minds, a way of organizing space and maintaining a mental map. His spot had a slight indentation in the stone floor, worn smooth by previous occupants. This indentation was both blessing and curse. It provided a minimal contour that cradled his hip bone, but it also meant the stone there was more polished and therefore felt colder. The second part of the preparation was removing outer garments, not for comfort, but for preservation. Guillaume had a thin woolen tunic and a pair of breeches. During the day, he wore both for warmth. At night, he would remove the tunic and spread it on the stone, then lie on it, using it as a minimal barrier between his body and the floor. The breeches he kept on for modesty and for the little warmth they provided to his legs. Other prisoners used their garments differently. Pierre, a farmer imprisoned for striking a tax collector, had managed to keep a cloak when he was arrested. This cloak was thick wool, well made, probably the most valuable item in the cell. Pierre would lie on half of it and pull the other half over himself, creating a kind of sleeping bag. The other three prisoners were intensely jealous of this cloak. But Pierre guarded it carefully and, to his credit, had never used it as leverage to demand extra food or preferential treatment. The third prisoner, Matthew, had been caught poaching deer from noble lands. He was young, perhaps 19, and had not yet developed the hardness that long imprisonment created. He had no extra garments, just the thin shirt and breeches he'd been wearing when arrested. He slept in a ball, knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped around his legs, trying to minimize the surface area of his body exposed to the cold air. It was a position of vulnerability, almost childlike, and it made the other prisoners protective of him even as they envied Pierre's cloak. Jean, the merchant, had a technique that fascinated Guillaume. Jean would sit with his back against the wall and enter a state that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't wakefulness either. He claimed he had learned it from a monk he had met during his travels, a meditation practice that allowed the body to rest while the mind remained alert. Whether this was truly what Jean was doing, or whether he had simply found a way to doze while sitting up, Guillaume couldn't say. But Jean always seemed more rested in the morning than the rest of them, despite sleeping in what appeared to be an uncomfortable position. The arrangement of four bodies in the cell followed a logic born of experience. They positioned themselves roughly in a square, each man with his head near a wall and his feet pointing toward the center. This created maximum distance between heads, which meant less disturbance from another man's movements, coughs, or snoring. It also meant that if one man needed to stand during the night, to relieve himself in the corner designated for that purpose, or to shake feeling back into cramped limbs, he could step over others' feet with minimal disruption. But this arrangement was for moderate nights, when the temperature was bearable. On the coldest nights, and Guillaume had now lived through one winter in this cell, had felt the stone become so cold it burned like fire against skin, the four men would abandon their separate positions and huddle together. The first time this happened, there had been awkwardness, even shame. Medieval men did not typically press their bodies together except in battle or in situations of extreme intimacy. To lie down with other men, to feel their warmth against your back, to be aware of their breathing and their heartbeats. It violated deep-seated norms about personal space and masculine dignity. But cold does not care about dignity. On a night when breath turns to frost in the air, when fingers become numb even tucked under armpits, when the cold seems to penetrate straight through flesh to settle in the bones, the warmth of another body becomes more valuable than pride. The process of forming the huddle was never discussed, never negotiated. It simply happened. Guillaume would notice Pierre shifting closer, and Jean would adjust his position, and Matthew would move in, and suddenly the four of them would be pressed together, front to back, forming a chain of bodies. The man on the outside would be cold, but the three on the inside would be relatively warm. After an hour, the outside man would grunt or shift, and everyone would rotate positions without a word spoken. This rotation required coordination in the darkness. The outside man would tap the shoulder of the man in front of him. That tap would be passed forward through the chain. Then, on an unspoken count, everyone would shift. The outside man would carefully step over the chain and settle himself on the opposite end. The chain would reform, and the new outside man would begin his cold hour. Guillaume marveled at how they had developed this system without ever explicitly discussing it. It was as if the necessity of survival had created its own language, its own choreography. The men could execute the rotation even when all four were more asleep than awake, moving through the steps automatically. But even on the coldest nights, sleep remained fragmented. The stone beneath them was always there, always hard, always stealing warmth. Guillaume would drift into light sleep, then wake from pain in his hip or shoulder. He would shift position, find a new arrangement of his body on the stone, drift off again. This cycle would repeat throughout the night. 10 minutes of sleep, 5 minutes of adjustment, 15 minutes of sleep, another adjustment. The pain points were predictable. Hip bone against stone was the primary one, an ache that would intensify over time until it became sharp and demanding. Shoulder was second, especially if lying on the side with an arm pinned beneath the body. The ribs on the lower side would protest, compressed by body weight with no cushioning. Knees, if bent and pressed together, would develop sore spots where bone contacted bone through only a thin layer of skin. Guillaume had learned to rotate his body in a specific sequence. He would start the night on his right side, his preferred position. After an hour or two, the hip pain would force him to his back, a less comfortable position overall, but one that distributed weight more evenly. His back position would last perhaps 30 minutes before becoming unbearable. The spine's contact with stone created a deep, diffuse ache. Then he would roll to his left side, the less preferred side, but still better than his back. Finally, if the night was not yet over, he might attempt to sleep on his stomach, though this position pressed his chest against stone and made breathing more labored. Each position had advantages and disadvantages. Side sleeping minimized contact area but concentrated pressure on hip and shoulder. Back sleeping distributed weight but made the spine ache and often led to snoring that disturbed cellmates. Stomach sleeping was the rarest position. It felt vulnerable, and it required turning one's face to the side against the stone, which most men found intolerable. Between these major position changes, there were constant micro-adjustments. Shifting the hip forward or back by an inch to move the pressure point. Bending the lower leg while straightening the upper one. Moving an arm from beneath the head to across the chest. These tiny adjustments were constant throughout the night, a continual negotiation between the body's need for stillness and rest and its protest against the stone's hardness. The temperature in the cell varied not just by season, but by time of night. The stone, which held cold so effectively, also had thermal inertia. It would be at its coldest just before dawn, having radiated away any residual heat from the previous day. This meant that even if a prisoner had managed to achieve some sleep in the earlier part of the night, the pre-dawn hours often brought waking cold that made further sleep impossible. Guillaume had learned to anticipate this. He knew that at a certain point, he couldn't measure time precisely but could sense it somehow. The cold would intensify. He would prepare for this by changing positions preemptively before the cold forced it. He would curl more tightly, draw his knees closer to his chest, tuck his hands more firmly into his armpits. These preparations might buy him another hour of fitful sleep before the morning bell sounded from somewhere above. The sounds of the cell at night formed their own landscape. There was Jean's steady breathing, occasionally interrupted by a wet cough that had been getting worse over the months, and that Guillaume feared meant lung disease. There was Pierre's snoring, a rhythmic rasp that somehow became almost comforting in its regularity. There was Matthew's occasional whimper, a sound that came during dreams and that the young man denied making when asked about it in the morning. And there were the rats. Always the rats. They were most active at night, scurrying along the walls, their claws making a particular scratching sound against stone. Sometimes they would grow bold and venture into the center of the cell, investigating the prisoners. Guillaume had been bitten once, a sharp pain on his exposed ankle that woke him completely. After that, he kept his feet covered as much as possible and never left his hands dangling in the darkness. The rats added another dimension to the challenge of sleep. You couldn't fully relax, couldn't allow yourself to sink into deep unconsciousness, because you needed to remain alert enough to kick or swat if a rat got too close. This constant low-level vigilance prevented truly restorative sleep, even on nights when the physical discomfort was manageable. The sounds from beyond the cell were fewer at night, but somehow more disturbing. Occasionally there would be screams from other cells, prisoners in pain, prisoners having nightmares, prisoners simply breaking under the psychological weight of confinement. These screams would echo through the stone corridors, distorted and magnified until it was impossible to tell how far away they originated. Sometimes there would be the sound of guards, their boots striking stone as they made rounds, their voices carrying in the darkness. The prisoners in Guillaume's cell had learned to identify individual guards by the sound of their footsteps, the heavy tread of the older guard who walked with a slight limp, the quick, sharp steps of the younger guard who seemed always to be in a hurry, the slow, deliberate pace of the head guard who sometimes stopped to peer through the hatches and ensure prisoners were where they should be. The approach of guards always created tension. Would they pass by? Would they stop? Would the hatch open? The uncertainty was worse than the actual interaction. Guillaume had learned to feign sleep when he heard guards approaching, to keep his breathing steady and his body still. The guards seemed to appreciate prisoners who caused no trouble, who simply endured in silence. The ones who shouted or pleaded or pounded on doors received nothing but curses and, occasionally, beatings. As the months passed, Guillaume noticed changes in his sleep patterns that disturbed him. He was sleeping less overall, perhaps 4 or 5 hours a night, divided into fragments. But he was also experiencing a phenomenon where he couldn't always tell if he had been asleep or awake. There would be periods of darkness and stillness where time seemed to pass, but he had no memory of sleeping, no dreams to mark the time as sleep rather than waking. This blurring between sleep and wakefulness was disorienting. It made the nights feel longer, made the passage of time even more uncertain than it already was. Guillaume began to fear that he was losing the ability to truly sleep, that his body was adapting to confinement in ways that were fundamentally unhealthy. He noticed similar changes in his cellmates. Matthew, the youngest, seemed to be sleeping more, but it was a lethargic, depressive sleep rather than healthy rest. He would lie on the stone for hours, even during the day, eyes open but unfocused, responding slowly when spoken to. Pierre still had his cloak and seemed to fare better than the others, but even he was becoming gaunt, his face hollowing out as the inadequate food and the constant cold consumed his body's reserves. Jean, the merchant who meditated while sitting, was the most concerning. His cough had worsened, and there were nights when he would cough continuously for an hour, his body racked by spasms that prevented any possibility of rest. The other three prisoners would lie awake during these episodes, unable to help, unable even to offer comfort beyond the occasional hand on Jean's shoulder in the darkness. They all knew, though no one said it aloud, that Jean was dying. The cough suggested tuberculosis or some other lung disease. In the free world, there might have been treatments, not cures. Medieval medicine was too limited for that, but at least measures to ease suffering, to make breathing easier. Here, there was nothing. Jean would continue to worsen until one morning they would wake to find him dead on the stone. His suffering finally ended. This awareness of death's proximity changed something about sleep. It became more precious, more urgent. Each night that you managed to sleep was a small victory, a temporary escape from a reality that offered no escape. But it also became tinged with fear, fear that you might not wake up, that your sleep might transition seamlessly into the final sleep. Guillaume found himself making bargains in the darkness, though he wasn't sure with whom or what. If he could just sleep a few hours, he would face the next day with strength. If he could manage to rest despite the cold and the hard stone and the rats, he would prove to himself that he was still strong, still capable of endurance, still alive in more than just the technical sense. These mental games became part of the nightly ritual. Lying on the stone, feeling the cold seep into his bones, Guillaume would tell himself stories about sleep. He would remember sleeping in his own bed before his arrest, the softness of a straw mattress, the warmth of wool blankets. He would remember sleeping outdoors during military campaigns, rolled in his cloak under the stars, uncomfortable by normal standards, but luxurious compared to this. He would remember sleeping as a child in his parents' house, the sense of safety and warmth that came from being surrounded by family. These memories were both comfort and torment. They reminded him of what sleep should be, what rest could feel like under better circumstances. But they also highlighted the grotesque abnormality of his current situation, the fundamental wrongness of trying to sleep on bare stone in a cold, dark cell. Yet even in these conditions, sleep sometimes came. Not good sleep, but sleep nonetheless. Guillaume would find himself suddenly aware that time had passed, that he had been unconscious for some period, that his mind had briefly escaped even if his body remained on the stone. These moments of sleep were like small miracles, unexpected gifts that made the nights slightly more bearable. And when the morning bell finally sounded, when the first sounds of the prison coming to life filtered down from above, Guillaume and his cellmates would begin the slow process of waking. Stiff limbs would be flexed cautiously. Cold, numbed fingers would be rubbed together to restore circulation. Eyes would open to the same darkness they had closed in, because here, morning looked no different from night. Another night survived, another day to be endured. And ahead, invisible but certain, another night on the stone, another attempt to find rest in a place designed to prevent it. Part 2. Stories of individual prisoners. The nobleman's tale. Robert Fitzwalter was not supposed to be here. Men of his rank, when they fell from favor, were typically confined in more comfortable circumstances. House arrest in a noble's manor, perhaps, or a tower room with a window and a bed. But Robert had made the mistake of opposing King John too publicly, too vehemently, during the negotiations that would eventually lead to Magna Carta. His imprisonment was meant as a message. Even nobles could be broken if they challenged royal authority too directly. The cell they gave him in the Tower of London was 10 feet by 10 feet, larger than most, a concession to his rank, but furnished with nothing except bare stone. No bed, no chair, no straw even. When the iron door clanged shut behind him on that first day in 1212, Robert stood in the center of the space and felt the cold rising from the floor like an invisible fog. He was 43 years old, accustomed to feather mattresses and warm halls, to sleeping in rooms heated by fireplaces and cushioned by tapestries on the walls. The transition to stone was more violent than any physical blow he had received in battle. That first night, he simply could not comprehend how to proceed. He sat with his back against the wall for hours, his mind refusing to accept that he was expected to lie down on the floor like an animal. When exhaustion finally forced the issue, he tried to lie on his back, hands folded on his chest, attempting to maintain some semblance of dignity even in these circumstances. The stone beneath him was so cold it felt wet, though it was perfectly dry. The cold penetrated through his woolen tunic and linen undergarments within minutes. His shoulder blades, his buttocks, his heels, every point of contact burned with cold. He lasted perhaps 30 minutes in this position before the cold forced him to stand. He paced the cell, trying to warm himself through movement. When exhaustion returned, he tried lying on his side. This was slightly better, less surface area in contact with stone, but the pressure on his hip bone was immediate and intense. He had never been aware of his hip bones before. They had simply been part of his body's structure, unremarkable and unnoticed. Now, with nothing but thin flesh between bone and stone, they made themselves known with insistent pain. Robert did not sleep that first night. As dawn approached, though he couldn't see it, he could sense some subtle change in the quality of sound from beyond his cell. He was shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. When the guard brought the morning meal, Robert tried to speak, to demand better conditions, to assert his rights as a nobleman. The guard simply laughed and closed the hatch. The second night was worse because Robert now knew what to expect. The anticipation of the stone's cold and hardness created a kind of dread that made sleep even more elusive. He found himself delaying the attempt to lie down, spending hours pacing or sitting, until his body simply gave out and he collapsed onto the stone in a position he hadn't consciously chosen. It was on the fifth night that Robert discovered his technique for survival. He had been lying on his side, the cold seeping into his hip bone despite his best efforts to shift position regularly. In a moment of desperate exhaustion, he had pulled his woolen tunic off over his head and spread it on the stone beneath him. Then he had lain on the tunic, using his body weight to press it flat, creating a thin barrier between flesh and stone. The difference was marginal but significant. The wool compressed under his weight but still provided some cushioning, some slight softness to ease the pressure points. More importantly, it absorbed his body heat instead of the stone absorbing it, creating a microclimate of warmth between his skin and the floor. This warmth was fleeting. Within an hour, the cold would work its way through the wool, but it was enough to allow him to fall into light sleep. Robert began to structure his nights around this discovery. He would wear the tunic during the day for warmth. At night, he would spread it on the stone and lie on it, drawing his arms close to his body and curling slightly to conserve heat. When the cold inevitably penetrated the wool, he would stand, move around the cell until he generated some body heat, then lie down again on the now slightly warmed tunic. Through this technique, Robert managed to obtain perhaps 3 or 4 hours of broken sleep each night. It was not enough. He could feel himself weakening, his thoughts becoming slower, his temper becoming shorter, but it was enough to survive. The key was accepting that sleep on stone would never be comfortable, would never be adequate, would never be restful in the way sleep should be. The goal was simply to achieve sufficient unconsciousness to give the body some minimal recovery time. But Robert's noble birth provided him with one advantage that common prisoners lacked: the possibility of outside assistance. His family, while they could not secure his release, could bribe guards to provide certain items. 3 months into his imprisonment, a guard slipped him a small bundle through the hatch. Inside was a cloak, not Robert's own cloak, which had been confiscated, but a rougher, cheaper garment that wouldn't attract attention or jealousy from other guards. This cloak transformed Robert's sleep situation. He could now lie on the tunic, pull the cloak over himself, and create a double layer of insulation. The effect was dramatic. His shaking from cold decreased. He could achieve sleep in longer stretches, sometimes 2 hours at a time before pain or cold would wake him. His overall time asleep increased to perhaps 5 or 6 hours a night. But the cloak came with a price beyond whatever his family had paid the guard. It created a psychological weight, a reminder of the world beyond the stone walls, of the people who loved him and were working for his release, of the life he had lost and might never regain. Some nights, wrapped in the cloak, Robert would weep silently, his body shaking with sobs rather than cold. These emotional releases exhausted him, but also, paradoxically, sometimes helped him sleep afterward, as if the weeping had purged some of the mental anguish that usually kept him awake. Robert also developed mental techniques for managing sleep. As a nobleman, he had been educated in Latin and French, had read philosophical texts, had been taught to organize his thoughts logically. He applied this training to the challenge of sleeping on stone. He would lie down and systematically relax each part of his body, starting with his toes and moving upward. My toes are at rest. My feet are at rest. My ankles are at rest. This methodical progression through his body parts served two purposes. It distracted his mind from discomfort, and it actually did promote muscular relaxation, which made sleep more accessible. He also developed what he thought of as memory theaters. Lying in darkness, he would mentally walk through buildings he had known, his own manor, the Great Hall at Westminster, cathedrals he had visited. He would try to remember every detail: the pattern of the floor tiles, the design carved into wooden beams, the colors in the stained glass windows. This mental exercise was engaging enough to prevent anxious rumination about his imprisonment, but not so stimulating that it prevented sleep. Often, he would fall asleep while mentally examining the details of a remembered ceiling, his mind drifting from memory into dream without clear transition. But despite these techniques and the relative advantage of the cloak, Robert still endured profound sleep deprivation. He kept a mental calendar, scratching marks on the stone wall to track days. By his count, he spent 14 months in that cell. During those 14 months, he estimated he never once achieved what could be called a full night's rest. Every morning, he woke tired. Every day, he felt his mental acuity declining slightly. Every week, he noticed his body becoming weaker, his muscles wasting despite his attempts to maintain strength through exercise. The psychological effects were perhaps worse than the physical ones. Robert began to experience episodes where he couldn't tell if he was awake or asleep. He would be lying on the stone, eyes open in the darkness, and he would see figures: guards, family members, even his dogs from home. These visions were utterly convincing in the moment. He would speak to them, would hear them respond. Only gradually would he realize that he was hallucinating, that exhaustion and isolation had blurred the line between reality and dream. These episodes terrified him more than anything else about imprisonment. He could endure cold, could accept hunger, could tolerate the physical discomfort of stone against bone. But the thought of losing his mind, of no longer being able to trust his own perceptions, filled him with existential dread. He began to devise tests for reality. If he could feel the cold of the stone, if he could hear the sound of his own breathing, if he could see, or not see, in the darkness, the walls around him, then he was probably awake. These tests helped, but were not infallible. Sometimes he would perform his reality tests while dreaming, and the dream would convince him he was awake. Robert's eventual release came through political changes beyond his control. When he finally walked out of that cell, 14 months after entering it, he could barely stand upright. His legs had adapted to the cramped space. His spine had curved from months of sleeping in fetal positions. His eyes could not tolerate sunlight. But the most profound change was psychological. For years afterward, Robert could not sleep in a normal bed. The softness of a mattress felt wrong, almost threatening. He would wake in a panic, disoriented, unsure where he was. Eventually, he had servants place boards beneath his mattress to make it firmer, and even then, he never slept through the night without waking. The stone had marked him permanently, not just through the aches in his joints or the weakness in his lungs, but through a fundamental reprogramming of what his body and mind accepted as conditions for rest. He had learned to sleep on stone, and that learning could not be fully unlearned. The Commoner's Tale. Thomas the Miller was not a bad man, but he was a desperate one. When the harvest failed and his children cried from hunger, when the local lord demanded taxes Thomas could not pay, Thomas made a choice. He took 3 loaves of bread from the lord's kitchen. Not stealing, he told himself. Borrowing. He would repay it when times were better. He was caught the next day. The punishment for theft from a noble was imprisonment, if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, it was hanging or loss of a hand. Thomas was lucky, after a fashion. He was sentenced to 2 years in the Lord's dungeon, after which, if he survived, he would be released to return to his family. The cell they threw him into contained 5 other men. Unlike Robert's solitary cell with its 10 by 10 dimensions, Thomas found himself in a space 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, but shared with 5 others. There was a hierarchy here, established long before Thomas's arrival, and as the newest prisoner, he entered at the bottom. The first night, Thomas was not permitted near any wall. The 5 existing prisoners occupied the perimeter, 3 along the walls, 2 in the corners. Thomas was left the center, the most vulnerable and uncomfortable position. He tried to sleep lying on his back, but twice during the night, other prisoners rose to relieve themselves and stepped on him, once on his leg, once on his outstretched arm. The second time, the prisoner didn't even apologize, just moved on as if stepping on another human being was an unremarkable occurrence. Thomas barely slept that first night. Every sound made him alert. Was someone approaching to attack him, to steal the few possessions he had brought, to establish dominance through violence? The stone beneath him felt impossibly hard. His whole body ached from a day of rough handling by the guards and the shock of transition from freedom to imprisonment. When morning came, marked by the guards' rounds and the distribution of food, Thomas was exhausted but also resolved. He would not spend every night in the center. He would earn a wall position. In a communal cell, advancement happened through a combination of longevity, physical strength, and social intelligence. Thomas had no longevity. He was the newest prisoner. He had some physical strength from years of work as a miller, but so did most of the others. What Thomas had was an ability to read people, to understand what they wanted, to make himself useful. He observed his cellmates carefully during those first days. There was Jeffrey, a large man imprisoned for assault, who held the prime corner position and served as the cell's unofficial leader. There was Simon, a wiry, nervous man who had killed someone in a dispute. He claimed self-defense, but no one believed him. There were the twins, Edmund and Edwin, imprisoned together for poaching. And there was old Harold, who had been here longest, 5 years now, imprisoned for debt he could never repay. Thomas befriended old Harold first. Harold had a wall position, but not a corner, a middle-tier position in the hierarchy. He was thin, constantly coughing, and Thomas suspected he would not survive much longer. If Thomas could become Harold's designated successor, he could inherit the wall position. He began by helping Harold during the day. Harold's hands shook, making it difficult for him to eat the thin gruel without spilling. Thomas would hold the bowl steady. When Harold's coughing fits made him weak, Thomas would help him lean against the wall in a more comfortable position. These small acts of kindness created a bond. After 2 weeks, Harold told Thomas he could sleep beside him, along the wall, instead of in the center. That night, with his back against stone instead of vulnerable space, Thomas slept better than he had since his arrest. The stone wall was cold, yes, but it was also solid, protective. No one could approach from behind. He could relax one entire side of his body's vigilance. The improvement was remarkable. He managed perhaps 4 hours of broken sleep instead of the 2 or 3 he'd been getting in the center position. But even against the wall, sleeping on stone remained a challenge that required constant adaptation. The hardness never became comfortable. The body never fully adjusted to it. What happened instead was a kind of resignation, an acceptance that this was simply how sleep would be from now on. Thomas's hip bones became bruised, then calloused. His shoulder joints ached constantly. But these pains became familiar, almost companions in the darkness. The communal nature of the cell created sleep dynamics that solitary prisoners never experienced. There was a phenomenon Thomas came to think of as synchronized suffering. On very cold nights, when all 6 men would huddle together for warmth, their breathing would gradually synchronize. They would inhale and exhale in unison, their bodies unconsciously coordinating. This synchronization seemed to calm everyone, to make sleep slightly more accessible. But there was also cascade waking. If one man woke suddenly, from a nightmare, from pain, from the need to urinate, his movement would often wake the man next to him, whose movement would wake the next man, until all 6 were awake and restless. On bad nights, this could happen multiple times, turning what should have been 6 or 7 hours of potential sleep into a fragmented mess of brief unconsciousness punctuated by repeated wakings. Thomas learned the importance of sleep etiquette in a communal cell. You moved slowly and carefully when rising in the night. You suppressed coughs as much as possible, covering your mouth and turning your face to the wall. You controlled your breathing to avoid snoring. You never shook or kicked another prisoner awake except in genuine emergency. Violations of these unspoken rules could lead to ostracism or violence. He also learned about sleep debts and their trading. On a night when one prisoner had been particularly disruptive, keeping others awake with loud nightmares, there would be social consequences the next day. The offending prisoner might find his food portion slightly reduced when Jeffrey distributed it. He might be excluded from the warmth-sharing huddle the next cold night. These informal punishments enforced collective discipline around sleep. As months passed, Thomas's body adapted in ways both helpful and disturbing. He developed the ability to fall asleep quickly when opportunity presented itself, a skill he'd never needed in his previous life, but that became essential in prison. If the cell was quiet for a moment, if his stomach wasn't cramping too badly from hunger, if the cold wasn't actively painful, he could drop into sleep within minutes. This rapid sleep onset was a survival adaptation, a way of grabbing rest whenever it was available. But he also experienced increasing sleep fragmentation. It became rare for him to sleep more than 30 or 40 minutes at a stretch. His sleep became a series of short episodes strung throughout the night, with long wakeful periods between them. During these wakeful periods, lying on stone in darkness, time seemed to stop. Minutes felt like hours. The wait for morning became its own form of torture. Thomas noticed that his dreams changed in prison. Before his arrest, he had dreamed of ordinary things, working at the mill, his wife, his children. Now his dreams were almost always about sleep itself. He would dream of lying in a bed, of feeling softness beneath him, of being warm. These dreams were so vivid that waking from them was devastating. For a few seconds after waking, he would be confused, would expect to feel a mattress beneath him. Then reality would reassert itself. The stone, the cold, the darkness, and the disappointment was physically painful. One particular dream haunted him throughout his imprisonment. In it, he would be lying on the stone as usual, but then the stone would begin to soften. Gradually, slowly, it would transform into earth, then into moss, then into something impossibly soft and yielding. He would sink into this softness, would be embraced by warmth, would experience perfect comfort. The dream was so pleasant that he would sometimes try to fall back asleep after waking, hoping to return to it. But there was a dark side to this dream. Sometimes it would turn nightmarish. The softness would continue increasing until he was sinking too far, being swallowed by it, unable to breathe. He would try to push back to the surface, but there was nothing solid to push against. The complete absence of the stone's hardness became as terrifying as the stone's presence was painful. He would wake gasping, actually relieved to feel the hard stone beneath him because at least it was real, at least it was solid. These dreams reflected Thomas's psychological state. He hated the stone, dreaded the nightly attempt to sleep on it, counted the days until he might be released and never have to experience it again. But the stone was also becoming his reality, his normal. The thought of anything else, softness, comfort, warmth, was beginning to seem like fantasy, like something that belonged to a different world or a different person's life. The social dynamics of communal sleeping created occasional dramas that would have been absurd in other contexts, but that became deadly serious in the confined world of the cell. There was an incident involving a rat, one of the regular visitors to the cell, that fell asleep on old Harold's feet. Harold, dozing lightly, didn't notice. But Simon, the nervous man who had killed someone, saw the rat and panicked. He grabbed a loose stone and threw it at the rat, missing the rat but hitting Harold's shin hard enough to draw blood and wake him with a cry of pain. The ensuing argument nearly led to violence. Harold accused Simon of deliberately injuring him. Simon insisted he was protecting Harold from the rat. Geoffrey had to intervene, using his position as cell leader to arbitrate. His judgment: Simon owed Harold 3 consecutive nights of giving up his wall position, sleeping instead in the center. Simon protested but ultimately complied, knowing that defying Geoffrey's judgment would result in being completely ostracized. Thomas observed this incident and learned several lessons. First, even small disruptions to sleep could trigger disproportionate reactions. Sleep deprivation made everyone irritable and quick to anger. Second, the informal social structure of the cell was essential for maintaining order. Without Geoffrey's authority, the situation might have descended into violence that would have left everyone worse off. Third, everything in prison became magnified in importance. A rat, which in the outside world would have been a minor nuisance, became the center of a significant conflict because sleep was so precious and so difficult. Old Harold died in the 8th month of Thomas's imprisonment. He simply didn't wake up one morning. The guards removed his body with no ceremony, no acknowledgement that a human being had died. That night, Thomas inherited Harold's wall position permanently. He should have felt victorious. He had achieved what he'd been working toward. Instead, he felt hollow. A man had died, and the main consequence for Thomas was a slight improvement in where he could place his body on stone. With a permanent wall position, Thomas's sleep improved marginally. He could now achieve perhaps 5 hours of fragmented sleep per night. But he also became aware of how tenuous this improvement was. If he offended Geoffrey, if he violated cell etiquette, if he showed weakness that made him seem like a valid target, he could lose his position. The need to constantly maintain his place in the hierarchy created its own form of stress that interfered with sleep. The twins, Edmund and Edwin, had a unique sleeping arrangement that Thomas found both touching and sad. They would lie face to face, foreheads nearly touching, and speak to each other in whispers until sleep came. Thomas couldn't hear what they said, but the soft murmur of their voices became part of the cell's nightly soundscape. They were the youngest prisoners in the cell, perhaps 16 when first imprisoned, and they clung to each other for emotional comfort in a way that older men had learned not to do. But even this bond sometimes created conflict. On nights when one twin was sick or distressed and couldn't sleep, the other would stay awake with him, and their whispered conversation would sometimes grow loud enough to disturb others. Geoffrey would hiss at them to be quiet. They would apologize and lower their voices, but an hour later, the volume would creep up again. This led to an arrangement where the twins were positioned in the corner farthest from Geoffrey, where their whispering would be less disruptive. Thomas also observed that sleep patterns changed with the seasons. Winter was the great challenge. The cold made sleep difficult for everyone, and the cell became a desperate place where all social norms were subordinated to the need for collective warmth. But summer had its own problems. The stone cell, so cold in winter, became stifling in summer. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. Sweat would coat everyone's skin but wouldn't evaporate in the heavy air, providing no cooling effect. Sleep became lighter, more restless. In summer, the guards would sometimes bring a bucket of water for the prisoners to share. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was precious. The prisoners would drink first, then would wet their hands and wipe their faces and necks. On the hottest nights, they would dampen their shirts and lie on the wet fabric against the stone, which would draw heat from their bodies through evaporative cooling. This provided perhaps an hour of more bearable temperature before the shirts dried and the heat reasserted itself. As Thomas's 2-year sentence progressed, he found himself thinking less about the future and more about the immediate present. In his first months of imprisonment, he had counted days obsessively, calculating how many remained until his release. He would tell himself, only 500 more nights on this stone, only 400 more nights, only 300. But this counting became torture in itself, making each night feel endless. He developed a different relationship with time. He stopped counting days and instead focused on seasons. He had entered prison in autumn. He would be released in autumn 2 years later. He had survived one winter on the stone, would survive a second. He had endured one summer's heat, would endure another. This longer time scale made the imprisonment feel less like an infinite succession of individual nights and more like a finite, if difficult, journey. The night before Thomas's release, he couldn't sleep at all. After 2 years of desperate struggle to achieve even minimal rest on stone, on this night when sleep should have come easily from relief and anticipation, it wouldn't come at all. He lay on his wall position, his body against stone for the last time, and felt a strange mixture of emotions. Joy at his impending freedom, fear about returning to a world that had continued without him, and, strangest of all, a kind of nostalgia for the terrible familiarity of this place. He had learned things on this stone that free people never learned. He had discovered depths of endurance in himself he hadn't known existed. He had found that the human body can adapt to circumstances that seem impossible. He had learned about the strange bonds that form between people who share suffering. He had learned to sleep where sleep should have been impossible. When the guard came to release him the next morning, Thomas stood with difficulty. His joints had stiffened from a sleepless night in one position. He walked out of the cell without looking back at his former cellmates. What was there to say? They would continue sleeping on stone long after he was gone. In the weeks and months after his release, Thomas found that he carried the stone with him. His sleep remained poor. He would wake multiple times each night, would feel his body automatically curling into the defensive positions he had learned in the cell. His wife tried to make his sleeping place comfortable, adding extra straw to his mattress, but Thomas found himself pushing it aside, preferring a harder surface. His body had learned lessons it couldn't unlearn. The long-term prisoner's tale. Certain prisoners were not meant to ever leave their cells alive. These were not prisoners awaiting trial or serving a defined sentence. These were prisoners who had been locked away and forgotten, whose crimes or perceived crimes were considered so severe that death was too merciful or too public a punishment. They would stay on the stone until disease, malnutrition, or despair ended their lives. Brother Anselm was such a prisoner. Brother Anselm had been a monk, a scholar, a teacher at a monastery with a reputation for learning. He had also been a heretic, or so the Inquisition determined. His crime: he had written a treatise questioning certain church doctrines, had circulated it among other scholars, had sparked theological debates that church authorities found threatening. His punishment: perpetual imprisonment in the depths of a castle that housed heretics and political prisoners. When Anselm was first lowered into his cell, an oubliette accessed only from above, with no door, no way in or out except through the trap door in the ceiling. He was 35 years old, in reasonably good health, and certain that the church would recognize their error and release him. That certainty sustained him through the first terrible weeks of adjustment, through the discovery that sleep on stone was a skill that had to be learned, through the cold and the darkness and the isolation. But weeks became months. Months became years. The certainty of release faded, replaced first by hope, then by doubt, then by a kind of grim acceptance. Anselm had now been in this cell for 8 years. He was 43 years old, though he looked 60, and he had learned things about sleep that few humans ever learn. The cell was circular, about 8 feet in diameter. The walls curved up to the trap door 12 feet above. There was no window. Light entered only when the trap door opened once a day, so guards could lower a bucket containing food and water and raised the bucket containing Anselm's waste. These were Anselm's only contacts with other humans. The faces of guards peering down, the sound of the bucket's rope creaking, the thud of the trap door closing. Sleeping in an oubliette presented unique challenges. The space was too small to fully stretch out. Anselm was of average height, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, but the diameter of his cell meant that if he lay straight, his feet would touch one wall and his head the opposite wall, with no room to spare. The curved walls meant there was nowhere to properly brace his back except in the exact center where the cell was widest. In his first years, Anselm had tried various sleeping positions. He had attempted to sleep curled in a ball, which maximized the use of space but put tremendous strain on his spine and hips. He had tried sleeping in a sitting position, back against the curved wall, but this prevented any real rest and left him with chronic pain in his lower back. He had tried sleeping on his stomach, which distributed pressure more evenly, but made breathing difficult and felt psychologically vulnerable. Eventually, he developed what he thought of as the rotation method. He would begin the night lying on his right side in a fetal position, knees drawn up, head pillowed on his arm. This position could be maintained for perhaps 90 minutes before the pain in his hip bone became unbearable. Then he would shift to his back, knees bent and feet flat on the floor to reduce strain on his lower back. This position lasted perhaps an hour. Then to his left side, mirroring the first position. Then to his stomach for brief periods. The cycle would repeat throughout the night. But the physical challenge of sleeping in an oubliette was only part of the difficulty. The psychological isolation was perhaps worse. Anselm had no cellmate to share the burden, no one to speak with, no one to share body warmth on cold nights. He was utterly alone with his thoughts, his fears, his memories, and the stone. In his first year, Anselm had maintained his monastic disciplines. He would pray at the canonical hours, though he could only estimate the time based on subtle cues like the temperature and his own hunger. He would recite psalms from memory. He would mentally review theological arguments, composing responses and counter-responses in his mind. These activities gave structure to his days and helped prepare his mind for sleep at night. But as years passed, maintaining these disciplines became increasingly difficult. Memory became unreliable. Anselm would begin reciting a psalm and realize halfway through that he couldn't remember how it continued. He would lose track of which prayers he had already said. Sometimes he would begin a theological argument in his mind and then forget mid-thought what point he was trying to make. This cognitive decline frightened him more than the physical deterioration. He could see his body wasting away, his ribs becoming visible, his legs thinning, his hands becoming skeletal, and while this was distressing, it seemed almost natural given the circumstances. But his mind had always been his greatest possession, the tool through which he understood the world and God. To lose his mental acuity felt like losing himself. Anselm developed a new nighttime ritual that combined prayer with what we might now call cognitive exercises. Lying on the stone, he would attempt to reconstruct entire books from memory, not theological texts, which now confused him, but simpler things. He would try to remember every psalm in order. He would recite the alphabet, then think of a word starting with each letter, then use each word in a sentence. These mental exercises served multiple purposes. They occupied his mind during the long hours of attempted sleep, they helped maintain his cognitive function, and they provided a measure of accomplishment. On good nights, Anselm could achieve perhaps 5 hours of fragmented sleep. But good nights were rare. More common were nights when sleep came in brief snatches of 10 or 15 minutes, separated by hours of wakeful lying on the stone. During these wakeful hours, Anselm faced the full weight of his isolation. He began to experience auditory hallucinations. He would hear voices, sometimes of people he had known, sometimes of strangers, sometimes in languages he didn't understand. At first, these hallucinations terrified him. He thought he was going mad, that the isolation had broken something fundamental in his mind. But over time, he came to accept them, even to welcome them. They were company, of a sort, in the absolute aloneness of the oubliette. Some of the voices seemed to speak directly to him. They would offer comfort, or condemnation, or simply commentary on his situation. Anselm understood that these voices were products of his own mind, projections of his thoughts and fears and hopes. But understanding their source didn't make them feel less real. On sleepless nights, he would hold conversations with these voices, would argue with them or agree with them or plead with them for answers to questions that had no answers. The most persistent voice was one he thought of as the doubter. This voice would appear during the darkest hours, usually when Anselm was lying awake in pain, and it would ask terrible questions. What if you're wrong? What if the Inquisition was correct and your beliefs are truly heretical? What if you've wasted your life on falsehood? What if there is no God and this suffering has no meaning? These questions would circle in Anselm's mind, feeding on his isolation and his exhaustion. But there was another voice, which Anselm thought of as the Comforter. This voice would remind him of beautiful things he had seen, of insights he had achieved, of students he had taught who had gone on to do good in the world. It would assure him that truth was worth pursuing even at great cost, that suffering could have meaning even if that meaning was invisible to the sufferer. On nights when the Comforter's voice was strong, Anselm could achieve something approaching peaceful sleep. The relationship between these voices and sleep was complex. Sometimes the voices would prevent sleep, would keep Anselm agitated and restless. Other times, the voices would seem to ease him towards sleep, their presence making him feel less alone. He learned to manage the voices, to engage with them when engagement was helpful, and to dismiss them when it wasn't. This management became part of his nighttime routine, as important as finding a comfortable position on the stone. Anselm also experienced visual hallucinations, though less frequently than auditory ones. Lying in the complete darkness of the oubliette, he would sometimes see lights, patterns, shapes, colors. Sometimes these lights would form into recognizable images, a face, a landscape, a book lying open. These visions never frightened him the way the voices sometimes did. They seemed gentler, more like dreams intruding into wakefulness. He learned to use these visions as a bridge to sleep. When lights appeared, he would focus on them rather than trying to dismiss them. He would allow them to develop into scenes, would mentally step into the scenes, would let the boundary between waking vision and sleeping dream blur and dissolve. Some of his most restorative sleep came during these episodes, when he couldn't quite say if he had been awake or asleep, seeing or dreaming. But the physical toll of 8 years on stone was severe. Anselm had developed chronic pain in his hips that never fully subsided, even during the day. His right hip, which bore his weight when he slept on his right side, was worse than his left. The pain was a deep, grinding ache that seemed to originate in the bone itself. Movement helped temporarily, but he couldn't move all night, and so the pain would intensify during sleep until it woke him. His spine had also suffered. Years of sleeping in fetal positions had given him a permanent curve. When the trap door opened and guards looked down at him, they saw a man who could no longer fully straighten his body, who moved with a hunched posture that made him look ancient despite being only in his early 40s. His hands and feet suffered from the cold. The oubliette was always cool, but in winter it became brutally cold. Anselm would wrap his hands in scraps of fabric torn from his robe, would tuck them under his arms at night, but still his fingers would go numb. He had developed chilblains, painful inflammation from repeated exposure to cold. In the morning, his fingers would be so stiff he could barely hold the food bucket lowered from above. Yet despite all this, Anselm had achieved something remarkable. He had learned to sleep with almost no resources in conditions that should have prevented sleep entirely. His body had adapted in ways that seemed almost superhuman. He could now fall asleep on stone within minutes, a skill that had taken years to develop. He could sleep through hunger, through pain, through cold. His sleep was never good, always fragmented, always insufficient, but it was sufficient for survival. He had also developed an acceptance of his situation that bordered on the transcendent. Anselm no longer spent mental energy hoping for release, fearing death, or raging at the injustice of his imprisonment. These thoughts and emotions still visited him, but they no longer controlled him. He had found a kind of equilibrium with the stone, with the darkness, with the isolation. He existed in the present moment, dealing with the immediate challenge of getting through each night, each day, without projecting forward or dwelling on the past. This mental state was not peace, exactly. It was more like a deep resignation that had worn grooves into his psyche the way water wears grooves into stone. He had been shaped by this place, his mind and body molded to fit the circumstances that seemed unmoldable. He had become, in some sense, a creature of the stone, someone who could survive in conditions that would break most people. On the night that marked 8 years since his imprisonment, Anselm lay on the stone and tried to remember who he had been before. The memory was dim, like looking at someone through fog. That man, the scholar, the teacher, the idealist who thought ideas mattered more than anything, seemed like a stranger. That man had never slept on stone, had never spent years in darkness, had never heard voices that weren't there. Yet Anselm didn't regret becoming who he was now. That might have been the most surprising thing. He had lost so much: freedom, health, his place in the world, perhaps eventually his life. But he had also learned things. He had discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. He had learned that the human being can adapt to almost anything. He had found that meaning can be created even in meaningless circumstances, simply through the act of enduring with dignity. As sleep finally came that night, after an hour of lying still, after the voices had quieted, after he had found the least painful position his aged body could achieve, Anselm's last conscious thought was a strange one. He felt grateful, not for his imprisonment, not for the suffering, but for having been forced to plumb the depths of human endurance and to discover that those depths went farther than he had ever imagined. He had been broken by the stone, yes, but in breaking, he had also been transformed into something harder, something the stone could not fully break. When Anselm died, 3 months after that 8-year anniversary, the guards who lowered the rope for his morning feeding found him lying peacefully on his side, hands folded as if in prayer, body curled in the position he had occupied for thousands of nights. He had fallen asleep and simply not woken up. The stone beneath his body was worn smooth in certain spots, polished by years of contact with human flesh and bone. That smoothness was the only mark Anselm left on the world that imprisoned him, but it was a mark nonetheless, proof that even stone yields, eventually, to sustained contact with human life. Part 3: Methods of Survival and Sleep. The survival techniques that medieval prisoners developed for sleeping on stone were not written in manuals or passed down through formal teaching. They were discovered through desperate experimentation, through trial and error, through the sharing of wisdom between cellmates. Some techniques worked for everyone. Others were highly individual, dependent on body type, personality, and the specific conditions of imprisonment. But certain principles emerged across different prisons, different countries, different time periods. Physical methods, working with the body. The most fundamental challenge was simply making contact between body and stone bearable. The human body has natural pressure points: hip bones, shoulder blades, elbows, knees, where bone comes close to the skin's surface with minimal cushioning. When these points press against stone for hours, the result is pain intense enough to prevent sleep entirely. The first survival technique was learning to manage these pressure points. Some prisoners discovered that slight shifts in position, moving the hip forward or back by just an inch, could transfer pressure from one small area to a broader surface, distributing weight more evenly. Others learned to place their arm beneath their hip in such a way that the muscle and fat of the arm provided minimal cushioning for the bone. This technique was effective for perhaps 30 minutes before the arm would go numb and need to be extracted, but 30 minutes of reduced pain was valuable enough to make the effort worthwhile. Clothing became both tool and treasure. Every scrap of fabric could be repurposed. Prisoners would remove their tunics and spread them on the stone as rudimentary mattresses. They would tear strips from the hems of their garments to wrap around knees or elbows, creating padding at key pressure points. In cells where multiple prisoners shared space, there would sometimes be elaborate negotiations about how clothing would be used at night: who got to lie on fabric, who had to lie directly on stone, how long each person's turn lasted. In some prisons, particularly those holding higher status prisoners or those where guards could be bribed, prisoners might obtain straw. A handful of straw seems like nothing, and by normal standards, it is nothing. But to a prisoner who had been sleeping on bare stone, a handful of straw represented miraculous comfort. Prisoners would guard their straw jealously, would pick through it to remove any damp or rotten pieces, would fluff it daily to maintain its cushioning properties. The straw would be arranged carefully before sleep. Some prisoners would spread it in a thin layer, trying to maximize coverage. Others would concentrate it at key points, under the hip, under the shoulder, accepting that most of their body would still contact stone, but ensuring that the most vulnerable points had some protection. The straw would break down over time, compressing into dust and losing its cushioning effect, but while it lasted, it could mean the difference between 3 hours of sleep and 5. Body heat management was equally critical. The stone's capacity to absorb heat was relentless. Without active countermeasures, hypothermia was a real danger, especially in winter. Prisoners learned to curl their bodies tightly before sleep, minimizing surface area and creating pockets of warm air close to the skin. They would tuck hands into armpits, draw knees to chest, curl shoulders forward. This fetal position was uncomfortable for the spine, but dramatically reduced heat loss. In communal cells, the most effective heat management technique was the sleeping formation described earlier, multiple prisoners lying front to back, creating a chain of bodies that shared warmth. But the success of this technique depended on social cohesion and trust. In cells where prisoners were hostile to each other or where fear of violence prevented close contact, prisoners might freeze to death within arm's reach of potential warmth. Some prisoners learned to use their own breath as a heat source. They would pull their tunic or cloak up over their head, creating a small tent, and breathe into this enclosed space. Their breath would warm the air inside the tent, which would warm their face and neck. This technique was effective but also risky. The enclosed space would become humid and could promote lung infections. Prisoners had to balance the immediate benefit of warmth against the long-term risk to their respiratory health. Movement before sleep was almost universally practiced. Prisoners would pace, would perform exercises, would deliberately generate body heat through muscle activity. This warmth wouldn't last long once they lay down on the cold stone, but it would provide a buffer period of 20 or 30 minutes when the cold was less intense, when falling asleep was more possible. Some prisoners developed elaborate pre-sleep exercise routines that served both to generate heat and to tire the body sufficiently that sleep could overcome discomfort. Psychological techniques. Working with the mind. The physical techniques for sleeping on stone had limits. No amount of positioning or clothing or heat management could make stone truly comfortable. This meant that psychological techniques, ways of managing the mind's response to discomfort, were equally important for survival. Many prisoners turned to prayer, and in medieval Europe's deeply religious context, this was a natural response. But prayer as a sleep technique had specific forms that went beyond simple devotion. Repetitive prayer, reciting the Pater Noster or Ave Maria hundreds of times, created a rhythm that calmed the mind and eased the transition towards sleep. The familiar words required no thought, allowing the conscious mind to disengage while the voice, internal or whispered, continued its repetitions. Some prisoners developed visualization techniques that anticipated modern meditation practices. A prisoner might imagine himself in a meadow on a warm day, feeling sun on his skin, hearing birds, smelling flowers. The sensory richness of this visualization could partially override the sensory input of cold stone and darkness. The practice required discipline. The mind would constantly try to return to the present reality, but over time, prisoners could learn to hold the visualization long enough to ease into sleep. Counting was another common technique, but not simple counting. Prisoners would develop elaborate counting systems that occupied just enough mental energy to prevent anxious rumination, but not so much that they prevented sleep. One prisoner might count backwards from 1,000 by sevens. Another might count imaginary sheep, but assign each sheep a name and a personality. Yet another might count stones in an imaginary wall, visualizing each stone's shape and color. Memory work served multiple purposes. A prisoner might mentally replay happy memories from before imprisonment, a wedding feast, a successful harvest, a pilgrimage to a holy site. These memories provided emotional comfort, reminding the prisoner of his identity beyond his status as captive. But they also created narrative flow, a story that the mind could follow towards sleep the way a child might fall asleep while being told a bedtime tale. Some prisoners engaged in mental construction projects. A carpenter might mentally design and build an entire house, visualizing each board, each joint, each nail. A farmer might mentally plan an ideal farm, deciding where each field would go, what crops to plant, when to plant them. These projects could extend over weeks or months of nights, providing continuity and purpose to the sleeping process. The management of fear was perhaps the most important psychological skill. Fear is the enemy of sleep. The body cannot rest when it perceives threat. Medieval prisons were genuinely dangerous places. Violence between prisoners was common. Guards might appear at any time to remove a prisoner for interrogation or execution. Disease could spread through the cells. Rats could bite. A prisoner who allowed himself to fully acknowledge these dangers would never sleep. Successful prisoners developed what might be called selective attention. They acknowledged dangers enough to take reasonable precautions, but didn't dwell on them. They would accept that, yes, something terrible might happen tonight. But since there was nothing they could do to prevent it, there was no value in lying awake worrying. This acceptance wasn't easy to achieve and required constant mental discipline, but it was essential for sleep. Some prisoners found that ritualization helped manage fear. They would perform the same sequence of actions every night before lying down, checking the door hatch, scanning the cell perimeter, insofar as they could see anything in the darkness, settling into their sleeping position, reciting a specific prayer or phrase. This ritual created a sense of control and predictability in an environment designed to eliminate both. The familiar sequence signaled to the brain that night was beginning, that sleep was permitted, that the fear could be temporarily set aside. Social strategies, working with others. In communal cells, survival techniques were necessarily social. The ability to coordinate with other prisoners, to negotiate fairly about resources and space, to maintain trust despite the desperate circumstances. These were essential skills for anyone who wanted to achieve regular sleep. The allocation of sleeping positions was the foundation of cell social structure. As described earlier, positions had value. Corners were best, walls were second best, center was worst. New prisoners entered at the bottom and worked their way up through some combination of longevity, strength, cunning, and social alliances. But this hierarchy had to remain somewhat fluid, or else it would break down through resentment and violence. Most cells developed rotation systems where sleeping positions would periodically change. The specifics varied, but a common pattern was weekly rotation. Each prisoner would move one position along the wall, with the corner prisoner moving to the center and the center prisoner moving to the wall. This system ensured that everyone experienced both the best and worst positions, which created a sense of fairness and shared suffering. The formation of sleeping partnerships was another social strategy. Two prisoners might agree to watch out for each other. If one had a particularly bad night and was exhausted the next day, the other would take on extra duties like distributing food or emptying the waste bucket. In exchange, when the roles reversed, the first prisoner would reciprocate. These partnerships created bonds of trust that were essential for psychological survival as well as practical survival. Noise management required social coordination. Snoring, coughing, nightmares, restless movements. All of these could disturb others' sleep. Cells developed informal rules about what was acceptable and what wasn't. Involuntary noises like snoring were tolerated up to a point, but if they became excessive, the snorer might be required to sleep in a different position, often on his side rather than his back, even if that position was less comfortable for him. Voluntary noises, talking, whistling, singing, were strictly forbidden during sleeping hours unless everyone agreed to their being permitted. The sharing of body heat on cold nights required negotiation about who would occupy the center positions, warmest, and outer positions, coldest, in the sleeping huddle, and how often rotation would occur. Cheating, refusing to rotate when it was your turn, claiming you had already rotated when you hadn't, could destroy the trust that made the huddle possible. Cells where trust broke down would see prisoners freezing separately rather than warming together, and the mortality rate in such cells was significantly higher. Storytelling and conversation before sleep served important social functions. They reinforced bonds between prisoners, reminded everyone of their shared humanity, provided distraction from the hardships of imprisonment. But they also had to be managed carefully. Conversations that became too emotional or too contentious could agitate prisoners and prevent sleep. Skilled storytellers learned to modulate their tales, building to interesting moments but never to moments of high tension or fear just before sleep time. The protection of vulnerable prisoners was sometimes a collective responsibility. If a cell contained someone who was old, sick, or simply weaker than the others, the stronger prisoners might ensure that person received adequate sleep even if it meant personal sacrifice. This protection wasn't purely altruistic. It served everyone's interest to keep all prisoners as healthy as possible, since disease or death in a small enclosed space affected everyone. But there were also genuine bonds of compassion that formed, perhaps surprisingly, in these brutal circumstances. Comparative techniques across regions. The techniques for sleeping on stone varied somewhat by region, influenced by climate, prison architecture, and cultural factors. In Northern Europe, England, Germany, Scandinavia, the primary challenge was cold. Prisoners in these regions developed the most sophisticated techniques for heat preservation. The use of group sleeping formations was more common, and the etiquette around rotation and position sharing was more formalized. In southern Europe, Italy, Spain, southern France, summer heat was often a worse challenge than winter cold. Prisoners in these regions learned to dampen their clothing and lie on the wet fabric for evaporative cooling. They learned to position themselves where whatever air circulation existed was strongest, even if those positions were otherwise less desirable. The siesta concept, common in southern cultures, influenced prison sleep patterns. Prisoners might achieve better rest by sleeping during the hottest part of the afternoon and remaining awake for portions of the night. Eastern European prisons, particularly in regions influenced by Byzantine or Islamic architectural traditions, sometimes had different designs that affected sleeping strategies. Some had raised platforms of stone rather than flat floors. Sleeping on these platforms was still extremely uncomfortable, but the elevation provided some protection from floor-level drafts and vermin. Other prisons had cells that were taller than they were wide, which encouraged vertical thinking about space use. Some prisoners would actually sleep standing or leaning against walls when horizontal sleeping was too painful. French prisons often incorporated oubliettes, the vertical shaft prisons described earlier. These required entirely different sleeping techniques since the space was too confined for normal horizontal sleeping. Prisoners developed the bracing techniques mentioned earlier or learned to sleep in a seated position with specific arrangements of limbs that minimized numbness and cramping. English prisons, particularly the Tower of London, sometimes housed higher status prisoners who had resources to bribe guards for small comforts. The techniques that developed in these contexts involved the strategic use of contraband items, an extra blanket, a pillow, writing materials that could be bundled as cushioning. The social dynamics were different as well, since prisoners with resources had more bargaining power with both guards and fellow prisoners. The role of animals in sleep strategies. An unexpected element in some prison sleeping strategies was the use of animals. Prisons were never fully sealed from the outside world, and small animals would find their way in. While rats were universal and universally unwelcome, some prisoners learned to use other animals to their advantage. In prisons located in rural areas, mice were common, and some prisoners would deliberately feed mice, encouraging them to nest near their sleeping area. The mice, tucked into corners or crevices, generated warmth. A nest of mice might raise the ambient temperature by a degree or two in their immediate vicinity. Not much, but potentially meaningful on the coldest nights. Cats were rare in prisons, but when they appeared, usually by accident through open drains or vents, they were sometimes tolerated by guards who appreciated their rat-catching abilities. Prisoners who befriended these cats could benefit from their warmth. A cat sleeping curled against a prisoner's chest or back provided significant heat, and the cat's purring created a soothing sound that helped some prisoners relax towards sleep. Birds sometimes nested in the upper portions of cells that had high ceilings and small openings. While the birds themselves provided no direct benefit to sleeping prisoners, their presence created a sense of connection to the natural world, a reminder that life and freedom still existed somewhere beyond the stone. Some prisoners reported that hearing birds settle down for the night helped them settle as well, creating a kind of sympathetic rhythm with the natural world's sleep cycles. There were even rare accounts of prisoners keeping insects deliberately. One account describes a prisoner who captured fireflies and kept them in a small container, using their light as a nighttime companion. The dim bioluminescence wasn't bright enough to be useful for seeing, but it created a focal point in the darkness, something to look at during wakeful hours. The prisoner reported that watching the gentle flickering of the firefly's light helped calm his mind towards sleep. Underground heat sources. Some fortunate prisoners were held in cells that, through accident of architecture, had access to residual warmth. Medieval castles sometimes had kitchens or forges that would generate heat throughout the day. If a prison cell shared a wall with these spaces, some of that heat would conduct through the stone, creating a marginally warmer sleeping environment. Prisoners in such cells would map out the warmth variations across their cell surfaces, identifying the warmest spots. These spots became highly valued real estate in the cell's social hierarchy. A prisoner with access to the warmest sleeping position might achieve an extra hour of sleep per night compared to someone sleeping on the coldest stone, and over months and years, this advantage could mean the difference between maintaining health and descending into fatal illness. Some prisons were built above or near natural hot springs or thermal vents. These were rare, but where they existed, the effect on prison conditions was dramatic. The stone floor might be merely cool rather than freezing, and in some cases, might even be slightly warm. Prisoners in these locations still suffered from hardness and other deprivations, but their survival rates were notably higher because they weren't fighting constant hypothermia. The philosophical dimension of stone sleep. Beyond the practical techniques for managing sleep on stone, some prisoners, particularly those with education or contemplative temperaments, developed philosophical frameworks that helped them endure the experience. These frameworks didn't make the stone softer or the nights shorter, but they provided meaning that made endurance possible. Some prisoners adopted what might be called an ascetic perspective. They saw their suffering as a form of spiritual discipline, similar to the deliberate deprivations practiced by monks and hermits. The stone became a tool for purification, stripping away attachment to physical comfort and forcing focus on spiritual realities. This perspective was easier to maintain for those imprisoned for religious reasons, but even common criminals sometimes adopted it as a coping mechanism. Others developed a Stoic philosophy, emphasizing their ability to maintain dignity and inner freedom despite external circumstances. The stone might constrain their bodies, but their minds remained free. Each night successfully endured on the stone was a small victory, proof of their continuing agency and humanity. This perspective required daily renewal. The temptation to despair was constant, but those who maintained it often survived longer than those who viewed themselves as purely victims. A few prisoners achieved something that might be described as acceptance beyond resignation. They didn't just endure the stone. They came to see it as part of their reality, neither good nor bad, but simply what was. These prisoners reported a strange form of peace, not happiness, but an absence of struggle. They slept on stone without constantly wishing for something different. And this cessation of internal resistance sometimes improved their actual sleep quality. Part 4. Extreme Nights and Extraordinary Challenges. Winter's Deadly Embrace. The nights that tested prisoners most severely were the deep winter nights, when temperatures in unheated stone cells could drop below freezing. Water would freeze in wooden bowls. Breath would turn to frost that coated walls and sometimes formed on beards and hair. Under these conditions, the question wasn't how to sleep comfortably. Comfort was irrelevant, but how to avoid freezing to death. On such nights, all social boundaries collapsed. Prisoners who normally maintained distance would press together without shame or hesitation. The formation wasn't the organized rotation of moderately cold nights, but a desperate heap of bodies, everyone seeking the center, the warmth. Arguments and fights could break out over position, but usually the shared threat of death suppressed individual conflicts. The prisoners on the outside of the heap, those whose backs were exposed to the frozen air, were in genuine danger. They would begin shaking violently, their bodies burning precious energy in an attempt to generate heat. If they remained on the outside too long, the shaking would eventually stop, which was a bad sign. It meant the body was no longer able to generate heat and was beginning to shut down. Experienced prisoners in communal cells had developed techniques for managing extremely cold nights. One was the continuous slow rotation where the mass of bodies would rotate like a wheel, each prisoner gradually moving from outside to inside and back again. This rotation had to be coordinated without discussion. Speech itself was dangerous because opening your mouth meant losing heat and required a level of cooperation that was only possible in cells where prisoners had lived together long enough to develop nonverbal communication. Another technique was the formation of layers. If there were 6 prisoners, they might form 2 layers of 3, with 3 prisoners lying on the bottom and 3 lying on top of them. The bottom layer was protected from above but pressed against the freezing stone. The top layer was protected from below but exposed to freezing air above. After an hour, the layers would switch. This technique was effective but required strong social bonds because the bottom layer was in a highly vulnerable position. Individual prisoners in solitary confinement faced extreme winter nights with no option for shared warmth. Their survival depended entirely on their clothing and their body's resilience. Some would spend the entire night moving, refusing to lie down at all, knowing that stillness meant death. They would pace their small cells continuously, hour after hour, fighting off exhaustion because exhaustion meant freezing. Others would attempt what might be called hibernation positioning, drawing themselves into the tightest possible ball, tucking every extremity, creating the smallest possible surface area. They would remain in this position for the entire night, neither moving nor sleeping, simply enduring. The morning would find them so stiff they could barely unfold their bodies, their joints frozen in position, but they would be alive. The mortality rate in medieval prisons spiked dramatically during winter cold snaps. Guards making morning rounds would sometimes find prisoners dead, frozen in whatever position they had occupied when their body's heating system finally failed. These deaths were often not recorded with any explanation. The prisoner had simply failed to wake up. But experienced guards knew the pattern and could often predict which prisoners wouldn't survive a particularly cold night based on their physical condition and the resources they had available. Disease and its impact on sleep. Medieval prisons were breeding grounds for disease. The combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, inadequate sanitation, close quarters, and the weakened immune systems of sleep-deprived prisoners created ideal conditions for tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, and plague. When disease struck a cell, the dynamics of sleep changed dramatically. A prisoner with tuberculosis, the most common serious disease in medieval prisons, would cough constantly, especially at night when lying down accumulated fluid in the lungs. This coughing prevented not just the sick prisoner from sleeping, but often everyone in the cell. The sound would echo off stone walls, loud and wet and relentless. It could continue for hours, a pattern of coughing fits separated by brief, quiet periods that never lasted long enough for others to fall asleep. Cellmates had to decide how to respond. The compassionate response was to comfort the sick prisoner, to help him sit up when coughing was worst. The vertical position sometimes eased symptoms, to offer water if any was available. But compassion required energy that sleep-deprived, barely fed prisoners might not have. Some cells would simply ostracize the sick prisoner, forcing him to the worst sleeping position, refusing to include him in warmth-sharing formations, essentially speeding his death so that the others might sleep again. Dysentery created different challenges. The need to defecate frequently meant the prisoner had to repeatedly rise, make his way to the cell's latrine corner, and return, disturbing everyone each time. The smell was overwhelming and affected everyone's ability to rest. Worst of all, dysentery was highly contagious in close quarters, meaning that one case often became multiple cases, transforming the cell into a place where sleep was almost impossible for anyone. During plague outbreaks, when a cell member showed symptoms, fever, swollen lymph nodes, delirium, the terror prevented sleep for everyone. Plague moved quickly. A prisoner who was healthy in the morning might be dead by evening. The others would lie awake, hyper-aware of their own bodies, trying to detect any signs of infection, knowing that they had certainly been exposed, that their fate was likely already determined. Some prisoners developed infection in the pressure sores that formed from sleeping on stone. These sores would become painful, then infected, then putrid. The infection would make sleep nearly impossible for the afflicted prisoner, while the smell of rotting flesh made sleep difficult for everyone else. Without antibiotics or even basic medical care, these infections often proved fatal, but death might take weeks or months, during which the entire cell suffered. The psychological impact of constant exposure to disease affected sleep in subtle ways. Even when no one was currently sick, prisoners knew it was only a matter of time. This awareness created background anxiety that made deep sleep difficult. Some prisoners reported dreaming about disease, about their own bodies rotting, about death coming in the darkness. These nightmares would wake them in terror, and then the challenge of falling back asleep on cold, hard stone with these images fresh in mind, was nearly insurmountable. Violence and the threat of violence. Medieval prisons were violent places. Fights over food, over sleeping positions, over perceived insults, or over nothing at all would erupt with little warning. Guards might appear at any hour to remove a prisoner for interrogation, which often meant torture. The threat of violence, from other prisoners or from authorities, cast a shadow over every attempt at sleep. In cells where one prisoner had established dominance through violence or threat of violence, the sleep dynamics were distorted. The dominant prisoner would claim the best sleeping position and the most resources. He might sleep soundly while others lay awake in fear. Or he might sleep lightly, maintaining vigilance against challenges to his authority, which meant constantly disturbing others with his movements and his aggressive reactions to any noise or movement he perceived as threatening. Some cells descended into what might be called failed social states, where trust had completely broken down and violence was always imminent. In these cells, no one truly slept. Everyone maintained constant vigilance, lying in defensive positions, jerking awake at every sound, getting at most brief periods of very light sleep that provided almost no rest. Prisoners in such cells deteriorated rapidly, their immune systems failing from stress and sleep deprivation, their rational thinking impaired, their ability to coordinate and cooperate destroyed. Sexual violence was a reality in some prisons, particularly for younger or weaker prisoners. The threat affected sleep profoundly. Victims would lie awake as long as physically possible, fighting exhaustion, because unconsciousness meant vulnerability. Some would arrange to sleep pressed against walls where they could monitor approaches from the front. Others would form protective alliances with stronger prisoners, trading labor or food for protection, and would only sleep when their protector was awake and maintaining watch. The arrival of guards at night created its own form of terror. When iron bolts would scrape open and a door would swing wide in the middle of sleep period, everyone would wake with hearts pounding. Who were they coming for? What did they want? Sometimes they were simply checking that prisoners were still secure. Sometimes they were removing someone for interrogation. Occasionally, they would enter in force to suppress a disturbance or to punish an entire cell for some infraction. After such interruptions, returning to sleep was almost impossible. Adrenaline would be coursing through every prisoner's body. The one who had been taken might return hours later, injured or broken, and his groans of pain would prevent any sleep. Or he might not return at all, and the others would lie awake wondering if they would be next, playing through scenarios, trying to prepare themselves mentally for whatever might come. The rituals of desperate nights. On the worst nights, those combining extreme cold, hunger, sickness, fear, and exhaustion. Prisoners would sometimes resort to rituals that bordered on the magical. These rituals had no practical effect, but they provided psychological comfort, a sense of agency in the face of overwhelming powerlessness. Some prisoners would recite specific prayers or phrases a precise number of times before allowing themselves to lie down, believing that this ritual would ensure their survival through the night. Others would touch the walls in a specific pattern or would position their bodies in precise orientations they believed were auspicious or protective. In some cells, prisoners would collectively engage in nighttime rituals. They might all recite a particular prayer together before sleep, creating a moment of unified purpose and mutual support. Or they might take turns telling stories of survival, tales of other prisoners who had endured and eventually been released, stories of miraculous escapes, legends of saints who had survived imprisonment through divine intervention. These stories were often embellished or entirely fictional, but they served a vital function. They maintained hope, and hope made sleep possible. Superstitions about sleeping positions proliferated. Some prisoners believed that sleeping with your head toward the east brought better rest and better dreams. Others would never sleep on their backs, believing this invited nightmares or demonic visitation. Still others would always keep one hand near their face, believing this protected them from evil spirits that move through the darkness. The truth value of these beliefs was irrelevant. What mattered was that they provided structure, meaning, and a sense of control. A prisoner who performed his ritual correctly could tell himself, "I have done what I can to protect myself. Now I can rest." This psychological permission to rest was sometimes the only thing that made sleep possible. Part 5. The psychological and physical toll. The body's slow dissolution. Long-term imprisonment with chronic sleep deprivation on stone surfaces created a constellation of physical ailments that often proved irreversible. The human body is remarkably resilient, capable of adapting to harsh conditions, but it also has limits. Prisoners who slept on stone for years crossed those limits. Their bodies transformed in ways that marked them permanently. The skeletal system bore the brunt of the damage. Hip bones, subjected to nightly pressure against unyielding stone, would develop areas of compression. The bone would actually change shape, becoming flattened where it repeatedly contacted the floor. This deformation was painful and permanent. Even after release, former prisoners would walk with altered gaits, their hips no longer moving in their original range of motion. The spine suffered perhaps even more. Years of sleeping in fetal positions, the only position that conserved adequate warmth, would create permanent curvature. The vertebrae would shift, discs would compress unevenly, and the natural S-curve of the spine would distort. Many long-term prisoners could never again stand fully upright. They would emerge from imprisonment hunched, their bodies having conformed to the shapes dictated by their cells. Joint problems were universal. Shoulders, elbows, knees, ankles, every joint that bore weight or pressure during sleep would develop chronic inflammation. Many former prisoners had arthritis by their 30s or 40s, their joints swollen and painful, their range of motion severely limited. Cold and dampness accelerated these conditions, turning what might have been mild age-related joint deterioration into crippling arthritis. The skin was another casualty. Pressure sores would develop at points of maximum contact with stone. These sores would break down the skin, creating wounds that, in the unsanitary conditions of medieval prisons and with the weakened immune systems of malnourished prisoners, would often become infected. Even if they healed, they left scars, discolored patches of skin, areas of permanent numbness, keloid formations that marked where the body had tried to repair itself. The muscular system underwent atrophy. Despite efforts at exercise, prisoners could not maintain normal muscle mass on inadequate diets with limited space for movement. The muscles that were used most for sleeping positions, those that maintained the fetal curl, might remain relatively strong, but other muscles would waste away. The result was a characteristic prison physique: thin limbs, sunken chest, but comparatively strong muscles in the back and core for maintaining sleeping positions. Respiratory problems were endemic. Sleeping in cold, damp cells promoted lung infections. Tuberculosis was common, but even prisoners who avoided TB often developed chronic bronchitis, or other lung conditions. The constant inhalation of stone dust, mold spores, and the exhalations of cellmates created a respiratory environment that damaged lungs over time. Many former prisoners had chronic coughs for the rest of their lives. The immune system, weakened by malnutrition, stress, and sleep deprivation, left prisoners vulnerable to every illness. Childhood diseases that their bodies had previously been immune to could reinfect them. Minor wounds that should have healed in days would linger for weeks. Prisoners would cycle through various infections, skin infections, gastrointestinal infections, respiratory infections, their bodies never fully recovering from one before the next arrived. The mind's transformation. The psychological effects of years sleeping on stone in isolation or intense communal conditions were as profound as the physical ones, though less visible. The human mind is extraordinarily adaptive, but prolonged stress and sleep deprivation rewire neural pathways in lasting ways. Time perception distorted dramatically. Without natural light cycles, without reliable markers of day and night, prisoners would lose their circadian rhythms. Some would develop a kind of temporal confusion where they couldn't accurately estimate how much time had passed. Minutes might feel like hours, or hours like minutes. Days would blur together. The ability to mentally organize experience into a coherent timeline would deteriorate. Memory function declined significantly. New memories became harder to form. A prisoner might not remember what he had eaten the previous day or what he had dreamed the night before. Long-term memories remained more intact, but even these would begin to fade or distort. Prisoners would find themselves unsure whether a memory was real or imagined, whether an event had actually happened or they had only dreamed it. Emotional regulation became increasingly difficult. The constant stress of imprisonment combined with sleep deprivation affected the brain's ability to modulate emotional responses. Prisoners might cry over minor frustrations or laugh inappropriately. Mood swings would become more dramatic and more frequent. The emotional numbness that some prisoners developed as a coping mechanism was itself a form of damage, a suppression of normal emotional life that could prove difficult to reverse. Social cognition suffered in predictable ways. Prisoners in solitary confinement would lose the ability to read social cues, to engage in normal conversational rhythms, to maintain relationships requiring nuanced emotional communication. Even prisoners in communal cells, who maintained some social interaction, found their social skills becoming narrowed and distorted by the abnormal social environment of the cell. Some prisoners experienced dissociation, where their sense of self would fragment. They might feel as though they were watching themselves from outside their body, or as though their body didn't quite belong to them. These episodes were frightening, but also sometimes provided psychological relief, a temporary escape from the immediate reality of physical suffering. Paranoia and hypervigilance developed in many prisoners. Even after release, they would startle easily, would scan their environment constantly for threats, would have difficulty trusting others. The vigilance that was necessary for survival in prison became an ingrained pattern that couldn't simply be switched off when circumstances changed. Sleep disturbances, paradoxically, often continued after release. Prisoners who had struggled to sleep on stone would find that they still struggled to sleep on comfortable beds. Their bodies had been trained to associate certain conditions with sleep, and when those conditions changed, their ability to sleep would deteriorate. Some former prisoners would deliberately recreate aspects of their prison sleep environment, sleeping on the floor, in cold rooms, with minimal covering, because only under these familiar conditions could they achieve rest. The testimonies of survivors. The most direct evidence of the long-term effects comes from the writings and testimonies of prisoners who survived to tell their stories. These accounts, though fragmentary and scattered across different time periods and locations, reveal consistent patterns of damage and adaptation. A French nobleman released after 7 years of imprisonment wrote, "I find that I cannot sleep except upon hardness. The bed my wife prepared for my return, filled with goose down, covered with fine linens, mocks me with its softness. I lie upon it and feel as though I am sinking, drowning. I cannot breathe. Within an hour, I rise and make my bed upon the floor, and there I find some measure of rest. An English prisoner who survived 12 years before being pardoned described his sleep in these terms. My body sleeps, but my mind does not. I am aware throughout the night of every sound, every change in temperature, every movement near me. I wake a dozen times, and when I wake I am confused, uncertain where I am or how much time has passed. The stone taught me to sleep like a hare rather than like a man, always alert, never deep, never truly resting. A German woman imprisoned for religious heresy for 5 years reported, "The hardest part of freedom is learning to be still. In my cell, stillness was survival. To move too much was to waste heat, to disturb others, to attract the attention of guards. Now I am free, but I cannot be still. At night, I pace my house, unable to lie down, unable to trust the darkness and the silence. My body remembers the stone and expects it. The absence of stone is somehow more difficult than its presence was." A Spanish merchant who spent 8 years imprisoned for debt wrote extensively about his sleep experiences in a manuscript that survives in a monastery library. He described the evolution of his sleep over the years. "In the first year, I fought the stone, hating it, resisting it with all my will. In the second and third years, I learned to work with it, to find positions and techniques that made sleep possible. By the fourth year, I no longer thought of sleep as something to be achieved, but simply as something that happened or didn't happen. By the sixth year, I had become so accustomed to the stone that I could no longer imagine sleeping otherwise. And now, 2 years after my release, I am learning sleep again as if I am a child, as if I have never done it before." These testimonies reveal that the damage was not merely physical or psychological in isolation, but existential. A fundamental alteration in how former prisoners related to the basic human experience of rest. They had learned to sleep under conditions that should prevent sleep, and that learning had rewired them in ways that made normal sleep difficult or impossible. The ultimate price. Not all prisoners survived their time on the stone. The mortality rate in medieval prisons was high, and sleep deprivation was often a contributing factor even when it wasn't the direct cause of death. A body weakened by lack of proper rest was more vulnerable to disease, less able to heal from injuries, more prone to despair-induced surrender to death. Some prisoners simply gave up. After months or years of fragmented sleep, of constant discomfort, of unending cold and hardness, they would make a choice, conscious or unconscious, to stop fighting. They would lie down one night and never truly wake up. Guards would find them the next morning, not obviously dead but unresponsive, and within a day or two they would be gone. Medieval people might have called this dying of melancholy or loss of the will to live. Modern medicine would recognize components of it, the effects of chronic stress, the shutdown of vital systems, but would still struggle to explain the final transition from life to death. Other prisoners died more directly from the conditions of their sleep. Hypothermia claimed many during winter cold snaps, as described earlier. Infections from pressure sores would sometimes spread through the body, causing sepsis and death. Respiratory infections, exacerbated by sleeping in cold, damp air, would develop into pneumonia that medieval medicine could not treat. Violence during nighttime disputes over sleeping positions or resources could result in fatal injuries. The guards who maintained medieval prisons were well aware of the mortality risks. Some were callous or cruel, viewing prisoner deaths as natural and inevitable. Others made small efforts to improve conditions, allowing extra straw before winter, turning a blind eye when prisoners obtained contraband blankets, spacing out interrogations to allow prisoners time to recover. But even the most compassionate guards were constrained by the purposes of imprisonment, to punish, to contain, and often to break prisoners psychologically. Better sleep conditions would have worked against these purposes. The bodies of prisoners who died were rarely examined systematically, and causes of death were rarely recorded with any specificity. A prisoner simply died, or took ill and died, or was found dead in his cell. The connection between their sleeping conditions and their death was not made explicit, though everyone involved understood it implicitly. The stone had done its work, slowly but inexorably, wearing down body and mind until there was nothing left to sustain life. Conclusion: the stone's enduring lessons. As morning light never truly penetrated the depths of medieval prisons, but guards and prisoners alike could sense its arrival through subtle changes in sound, in routine, in the quality of darkness that was never quite complete. This daily transition from night to day, from attempted sleep to resumed endurance, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of prisons throughout medieval Europe, represents one of the least examined but most universally experienced aspects of imprisonment in that era. The question that opened this exploration, how did medieval prisoners sleep on stone, has no single answer because there were as many answers as there were prisoners. But certain truths emerge from the accumulated testimony, the physical evidence, the records that survive. First, sleep on stone was never comfortable. The human body did not adapt to stone in the sense of becoming comfortable with it. Instead, bodies developed the capacity to extract minimal rest from terrible conditions. The difference is significant. Prisoners did not learn to sleep well. They learned to sleep barely enough to survive. Second, sleep in medieval prisons was necessarily a social activity, even for solitary prisoners. The prisoners who survived developed relationships with the stone itself, with the darkness, with the cold, relationships that involved negotiation, understanding, and grim cooperation. In communal cells, sleep required constant social negotiation, trust building, and coordination. The ability to sleep was directly connected to the ability to maintain human connections under dehumanizing circumstances. Third, the techniques prisoners developed for sleeping on stone represented extraordinary ingenuity and resilience. With almost no resources, in conditions designed to prevent rest, facing threats to survival from multiple directions, prisoners invented methods for achieving sleep that demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination. These were not grand innovations that changed history, but they were innovations nonetheless, small victories of human will against seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Fourth, the price of sleeping on stone was permanently paid in body and mind. Prisoners who survived and were eventually released carried their imprisonment with them for the rest of their lives. The stone had marked them, had changed them, had taught them lessons about suffering and endurance that they could never fully unlearn. Many would have said, and some did say in their writings, that they never truly left their cells even after physical release. But perhaps the most remarkable conclusion is simply this: they did sleep. Despite everything, despite the cold and the hardness and the fear and the hunger and the darkness and the violence and the disease and the despair, medieval prisoners found ways to sleep. Not well, not enough, not without damage, but enough to continue existing, enough to maintain some spark of consciousness and will, enough to survive another night and then another after that. There's a story that captures something essential about this experience, though its details have become obscured through centuries and cannot be definitively verified. It concerns a prisoner in a French fortress who had been imprisoned for more than 15 years, who had spent thousands of nights on stone, who had endured winters that killed weaker prisoners and summers that brought disease. His crime is forgotten, his name uncertain. Records refer to him only as the Old One, or the one who does not speak. This prisoner had developed a reputation among the guards for being nearly indestructible. He survived conditions that killed younger, healthier prisoners. He endured on the minimal rations provided, required no special treatment, caused no trouble. He was simply there, year after year, sleeping on his stone, waking to another day, sleeping again. A new guard, young and curious, once asked an older guard how this prisoner managed to survive when so many others died. The older guard thought for a moment and then said something that was recorded in the fortress records. He learned the stone's secret. When pressed to explain, the older guard elaborated. The stone is hard, and it does not change. It is the same today as it was 1,000 years ago, and it will be the same 1,000 years from now. Most prisoners fight this. They want the stone to change, to soften, to warm. They exhaust themselves in this fight, and the exhaustion kills them. But the old one stopped fighting. He learned to change himself instead. He became like the stone, hard, enduring, unchanging. And because he no longer fights the stone, he can sleep on it. Whether this story is literally true or not matters less than what it reveals about medieval understanding of imprisonment and survival. The stone was not just a physical surface, but a metaphysical challenge. To survive, sleeping on stone required becoming, in some sense, stone-like, developing a hardness, an ability to endure without expecting relief, an acceptance of conditions that could not be changed. Modern readers might view this as tragic, as a kind of death of the spirit, even if the body survived. And perhaps it was. But it was also a form of transcendence, not upward toward some higher state, but downward into the bedrock of existence, into the question of what remains when everything else is stripped away. What remains is the capacity to endure, not the desire to endure, not the hope of something better, but simply the bare capacity to breathe, to wake, to sleep, to continue. The prisoners who survived their time on medieval stone discovered this capacity in themselves, often to their own surprise. They learned that they could sleep where sleep should be impossible, could rest where rest should be denied, could continue when continuation seemed pointless. The stones of medieval prisons still exist. Many have been converted into museums or historic sites. Tourists walk through them during the day, exclaim at how terrible the conditions must have been, take photos, and leave. The stones remember nothing, but they bear witness nonetheless. In certain cells, you can still see the places where stone has been worn smooth by centuries of human contact. Bodies pressing against walls, hands gripping surfaces, prisoners positioning themselves night after night in the same spots. These worn places are perhaps the truest memorial to the prisoners who slept on stone. Not monuments or plaques, but the physical impression of human suffering on unyielding material. The stone was changed, minimally but measurably, by sustained contact with human life. And the humans were changed far more dramatically by their contact with the stone. In the end, the story of sleeping in medieval prisons is not primarily about stone or cold or suffering. It's about the extraordinary resilience of human beings, our capacity to adapt to circumstances that should destroy us, our ability to find rest even in restless places, our stubborn refusal to surrender even when surrender would be easier. The prisoners who slept on stone in medieval dungeons were not heroes in any conventional sense. They were simply people trying to survive impossible circumstances, using whatever resources they had, which was almost nothing, to achieve minimal rest. But in that minimalism lies something profound. They prove that humans can sleep anywhere, can rest under any conditions, can find fragments of peace even in places designed to deny all peace. They prove that the will to survive can manifest in small, unglamorous ways, not through dramatic escapes or bold resistance, but through the simple act of lying down on cold stone night after night and somehow achieving enough sleep to wake and face another day. The stone beneath them was indifferent to their struggle. The darkness around them acknowledged neither their suffering nor their resilience. The cold cared nothing for their efforts to stay warm. Yet they slept. They survived. They endured. And in their endurance, they left a testimony that echoes down through centuries. That the human capacity for adaptation and survival extends far beyond what we imagine possible. That rest can be found even on the hardest surfaces. That sleep, that most basic and essential of human needs, can be achieved even under conditions that seem designed to prevent it forever.